See, I'm not saying that other people are wrong. I'm just saying that they can't tell me that I'm wrong. 6 months ago, I made the decision to put my French on hold indefinitely in order to focus full-time, if you will, on my Swedish. And there's a lot around that. There's a lot of people had varying opinions on that, and I have varying opinions on that. And now that I've had 6 months to reflect on what this has done for my language learning, what it's done for my life, good, bad, ugly, everything, I am going to talk about that to you. If you're new here, my name's Lamont. I'm Australian, so please don't ask me what my native language is. If you're old here and you like the content, then please consider supporting me over on Patreon, where you'll get bonus content, including things like extended cuts of videos, outtakes, scripts, language learning updates, even podcasts every now and then. The next bit's going to be in Swedish, so turn the subtitles on. Now I'm going to do it in one take to try to give you an idea of what my Swedish is like these days. So there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be times where I say one thing and then a different thing, and going to be times where I use two prepositions instead of just the one that was needed, all that kind of stuff. But that's just giving you an idea. Now the whole video isn't in Swedish because I honestly hate doing subtitles for whole videos. It just takes forever. Vi ska börja med fördelar, vilket är alltid en bra sak att börja med. Och jag skulle säga att den största fördelen är att jag har förenklat hela grejen. Typ att, så om vi tar ett exempel. Innan jag slutade med franska lärning brukade jag fundera över vilket språk jag skulle plugga varje dag. Jag typ vaknade och undrade över om det var en bra dag att plugga franska eller svenska. Men idag har jag inget val. Det är bara ett språk som jag försöker lära mig. Så det är typ att jag pluggar svenska helt enkelt varje dag. Och det betyder faktiskt att jag pluggar mer än vad jag brukade. För att jag spenderar inte så mycket tid över att fundera om jag ska plugga eller inte. Och vad jag ska plugga. Skulle jag plugga franska eller svenska? Nej, idag så pluggar jag bara svenska för att det känns inte som ett val. Men det är inte en dålig sak skulle jag säga. Jag skulle säga att det är typ en enkel sak att göra varje dag, för att ibland så tittar jag på någonting på svenska, eller så läser jag på svenska, eller så lyssnar jag på en bok, en ljudbok förstås, på svenska. Men jag brukade ha så svårt över att de enkla sakerna som om vilket språk jag skulle plugga varje dag. Och det var ju inget bra. It's also simplified things in my life on a grander scale, like what I'm trying to do with the languages. So I was just trying to get French and Swedish to as high levels as possible. And it was working in that, yes, I was learning the two languages at the same time. I was becoming better at both of them. For me, I realized that it was only possible to reach the kind of heights that I'm looking to reach in Swedish by only focusing on Swedish. And the same would go for French. If I wanted to get my French to a really high level, which I do one day, I would need to only be focusing on French. And that's led to just other simplification. Like, it's funny how one simplification at even a kind of medium or even a low level can lead to broader simplifications. For example, talking to my son, my 4-month-old. I had been rushing to get my spoken French up to a level that meant I could speak to him. And I had such dumb reasons for doing that. Basically, people would say, are you going to speak to him in a second language? And then they would suggest French when they heard that I spoke those two, because they're like, oh, it's more useful, more people speak it and stuff. Yeah, that may be true, but what good is that when it's not my second best language? When it's so much worse than my English and then still worse than my Swedish? That's just stupid. If I'm going to speak to him in a second language, it needs to at least be the language that I speak second best. It even makes things that you would think would be made more complicated by only focusing on Swedish. It makes those things easier. For example, finding content. Now, there's not nearly as much content in Swedish as there is in French, especially dubbed things. So if I want to watch just anything I want, like just some American movie, but I also want to work on my language at the same time, at that point, yes, studying French would be more helpful because I can watch it dubbed into French and at least be doing something for my French. And I can never watch it dubbed into Swedish unless it's a kids show. That actually makes still everything simpler because there's so many things I look at to see if I want to watch it and work on my Swedish at the same time, and it just rules that thing out completely. Whereas before, when I was studying both languages, even on so-called Swedish days that I should have been doing Swedish, I would sometimes find something that I wanted to watch and see, it doesn't have Swedish, but it does have French. Maybe I should just work on... These days, it's just, does it have Swedish? No, okay, it's out. Find something in Swedish. And because my Swedish has gotten a lot better than it would have in the last 6 months by just focusing on that, that has also made the whole thing simpler because I can watch native speaker content with or without Swedish subtitles and be working on my Swedish through sort of organically just through that stuff. I can also watch stuff that isn't in Swedish with Swedish subtitles. Now, I know that might not sound particularly beneficial, but the better you are at your language, the more beneficial it is. Even stuff that's in a language that you speak, like for example English, with Swedish subtitles, I've still found helpful. And of course I've just got the fact that my Swedish has become so much better in the last 6 months that almost all content has become more useful for me. So I can watch YouTube videos where they're just talking off the cuff and very fast and talking among friends and stuff, and that's beneficial because I can actually understand what's being said. And then I've got, you know, high-level series about terrorism and stuff like that that I can watch, and I can read books that used to be completely incomprehensible to me because of the style that they were written in. Basically, all things open up and become a possibility of something that I can learn from. The decision to speak to my son in Swedish has been very different from what I expected. I expected it to be this kind of constant struggle to remember to speak to him in Swedish and to try and think of what I'm trying to say. And it's actually been kind of the opposite. Because I did it so early, I did it from day one, it just became completely normal in my brain to speak to him in Swedish, even though it's very obviously not as comfortable for me as English is. When I speak to him, it's actually very uncomfortable to use English. And sometimes I have to because I'm speaking to him, but I'm actually saying something for my wife to hear. So it's been quite an odd thing to get used to this idea that I am constantly communicating with this person who can't actually understand me in a language that no one else around understands either. But it's been really good. It's actually been, if nothing else, good for my Swedish because it's definitely improved my speed of thinking because I'm spending a lot more time than I would have expected thinking in Swedish. And these days, when I've been talking to him, even for just a few seconds, and I have to revert back to English to say something either to my older son or my wife, I do have this odd pause sometimes, and sometimes I even say something in English in a kind of Swedified form. And I know that sounds like flexing, but I'm just kind of trying to take you through how my brain is working around this whole thing. Additionally, we've been watching content, that is, my son and I have been watching like little kids shows in Swedish, which he's only just sort of starting to get the idea of like a moving picture on a screen. I know it's not necessarily great to introduce kids to screens so early, but at least if it's going to also be in a second language, I think that's a good thing. Now, I want to say that if you're getting annoyed with this because you're studying more than one language at a time, maybe even 3 or 4 at the same time, and you're thinking, yeah, but you're missing all these things, you know, you haven't said all this other stuff. I completely agree with you, okay? There's pros and cons. There definitely are. It's a question of personality for me. I happen to not like only being half good at things. I happen to not like what I'm going to meanly call sucking at things. Now, my Swedish doesn't suck. It doesn't suck for an Australian person, but compared to a native speaker, it sucks. It's terrible. Okay? So I don't like that feeling. Even though I'm making a massively unfair comparison to a native speaker, I just don't like it. I like making everything as good as it could be. And one of the things that tipped me over to push French aside was seeing Ollie Richards talking to Matt versus Japan.
But I often feel the lack of proficiency in any of them, you know. And I see what you've done with Japanese, and I think, man, you know what, I think I might actually trade all of my languages for one, which is at the level of your Japanese.
That made me wonder, like, would I give up other languages just to speak one language to that higher level? And the answer is definitely yes. And certainly, since for me it's only one other, would I let my French pay the ultimate sacrifice in order to make my Swedish that good? Yes, I would. Now, I'm not saying that it's a question of that, but I realize that my personality prefers to have one to that outstandingly good level. And I also think that that will be more useful to you guys for this channel if I'm a guy who has taken one to the very top level, a bit like Matt versus Japan's channel, nowhere near that yet, but I want to be one day. See, I'm not saying that other people are wrong to study more than one language at the same time. I'm just saying that they can't tell me that I'm wrong to focus on one. So we've talked about pros and particular effects on my life with my family and everything. What about some cons? Are there downsides? Yes, there are always downsides. There are downsides to everything. Even things that are basically universally acknowledged as a positive thing have some kind of downside that may be totally worth paying. People have asked me if I miss it. As a language to hear and to speak, not really, I'm going to be honest. So I don't miss it as an activity to speak or listen to, but I do miss the potential content that I could get from it. I said before that there's a lot more content in French, especially dubbed things, but that's not what I mean. I'm not interested in the dubbed things. There's a few things that are natively in French, series that I want to watch for my second channel and just for my interest, that are probably really good. Some of them are very, very long. They would be huge amounts of content that I could just soak in French. That would be awesome, that I'm deliberately avoiding because I don't want my French I don't want French in my brain. I don't want it messing up my Swedish. Another thing I miss is having a parent. And for those who don't know what a parent is the one or two people that you find that you deliberately try to sound like all the time, and that you do more listening to of them than of anyone else. So they act like your parents did in your native language, so you hear them more than anyone else. The idea is that it's easier to sound like a single person than it is to sound like all the French people you've ever heard speak French. And there's all these kinds of rules, for want of a better word, as to how to find a parent. They've got to be like around your age, they've got to be of your gender, blah, blah, blah. And I had found mine in French, whereas I don't have one in Swedish. I've never found the perfect person to mimic and to listen to more of than anyone else in Swedish. So I do miss having a parent. The other thing I miss is that one day I wanted to actually go to Belgium. There's someone in particular that I wanted to interview there, and I wanted to do that interview in French. She's French-Belgian, and there were some other French speakers that I kind of had in my book as potential interviews that I'd like to try and get to a level where I can interview that person and do it in French, and all of that's on hold now. It may happen one day in the future. It may take me that long to even get myself to a level where I would even be able to interview someone like that. We're talking people much higher pay grade than me, if you get what I mean. Some of you may be wondering if my French is dropping off, or how quickly and how my French is in general these days. I don't actually know. It's hard to tell without trying to speak French. However, I do occasionally get clues that it's mostly still there, and I think it would come back very quickly. Now, this isn't going to be the case for all people at all levels of all languages. My French was basically at a B2 level, not for spoken. I definitely couldn't speak at a B2 level. I could speak at a B1 level, but I could understand actually even higher than that. I could generally understand what someone was talking about, no matter what they were talking about or how fast they were saying it, obviously with some exceptions. In fact, I did quite an in-depth test that awarded me a C1 level, which is definitely not the case, but that does show that the kind of level we're talking about, it's higher than a lot of people get before they then go away from a language. And so that those lower levels, they're going to drop off more quickly. Also in French, I think it's probably the slowest language to drop off for an English speaker, because you've got about half the vocabulary already. So your vocabulary is not going anywhere fast. Basically, I wouldn't expect the same thing to happen for a native English speaker who ever gets their Japanese or Russian to the same level. Don't expect that to hold quite as well as French does. I should also say that I actually kind of needed a silent period in French, because I had started learning French in exactly the same way that I learned Swedish, which was just to speak early and speak a lot. And that can be good. I still think there are reasons that the advantages that this can have, but generally if you want to reach a very high level of a language, I don't think it's a good idea. I now think that getting a lot of input very early until you have a very good understanding of the language is a better idea if you can possibly tolerate that. So I needed a silent period. I needed a long time where I was just getting input. Now, obviously I haven't had the input because I've been focusing on Swedish, but I think that when I go back to French, I'll be much more comfortable with just taking things in, just reading books, just watching series, all that kind of stuff, and not actually speaking. And after that, I think my French will skyrocket much faster than it would have if I'd even just put aside my Swedish and focused on French, and certainly much faster than it would have with studying both at the same time. The ultimate question, I guess, is, was it worth it? Like, has my Swedish improved enough for it to have been worth it to stop studying French? I think it's very hard to say just based on a level, because I kind of don't really remember what level I was at in Swedish 6 months ago. I've got recordings and things like that, but it's still hard for me to gauge the level of comfort, and that's what I was sort of trying to improve, was the comfort with which I can say things. It's definitely improved. Whether it's improved as much as I hoped it would, well, yes, actually, I think it's improved more. I'm actually quite surprised at how easily I do things in Swedish and how quickly that's changed since just putting French aside. How much stuff I watch with basically 100% comprehension. My speaking is still not where I'd like it to be, and I've just got to spend a lot of time speaking and getting input and, all the normal speaking practice kind of stuff, and that's okay. Basically, I think that my potential in Swedish has improved greatly. I think that by maybe July, August, September next year, I may be speaking the sort of Swedish that I would have only been reaching in literally 2023, and I think that's actually a conservative estimate if I'd continued the two languages at the same time. So I've obviously been getting questions about when I might be looking to return to French, and it's too early to say. I'm still not happy with where my Swedish is at. I'm very happy with the progress I've made, but I'm not happy with the ultimate level of it. I really want to be sure that I really do speak Swedish to a very high level. I basically would want it to be that a conversation in either language is, as in English or Swedish, is equally comfortable. And I know that's a very high level to get to, but other people have gotten there in not just one, but 2 or 3 foreign languages. And I do think I can do it with just more time focused on Swedish. That's the kind of level I'd want to be at before I consider returning to French, but also maybe never. I may never actually pick up French again. This is sort of complicated as to why, and I spoke about it with Stefano from Lingua Passione the other night, but basically I'm just becoming more interested in languages that are a little bit harder, not just because they're harder, but just to see how the process of learning them differs. Because let's face it, with French, you can basically dive into mass input. And I think that's in a way cheating if I'm then going to dole out advice on how to learn languages. I think it'd be good if I've learned something a little bit trickier, something with a foreign script or with characters or something like that. That's not to say I will do that. I may spend a year hardcore focused on French. I don't really know. I don't think it's good to decide things for the future, like in 2022 I'm going to do this. I think it's good to see where you're at that time. Also, another possibility is that I get my Swedish to a very high level and then go and use that in some kind of different way rather than always just focusing on languages. I will always be happy to speak to you guys about how to learn languages, about what I'm up to in my life, but that might not always be active language learning. So guys, hopefully the final cut of this video is not as rambly as it seemed to me, because it was really rambly in real life. If you want to see a bit more of the stuff that I talked about, there will be what I call a director's cut of this video on Patreon, so please consider supporting me on there. Use any of the links in the description, they all help me out. Make sure you commented, unsubscribed, and all that stuff. I'll see ya. Bye.